In 1815, Britain was a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and two political parties. Still, it was far from democratic. Although members of the House of Commons were elected, less than 5% of the people had the right to vote. Wealthy nobles and squires, or country landowners, dominated politics and heavily influenced voters. In addition, the House of Lords, made up of hereditary nobles and high-ranking clergy, could veto any bill passed by the House of Commons. Long-standing laws kept many people from voting. Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants, for example, could not vote or serve in Parliament. In the 1820s, reformers pushed to end religious restrictions. After fierce debate, Parliament finally granted Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants equal political rights. An even greater battle soon erupted over making Parliament more representative. During the Industrial Revolution, centers of population shifted. Some small towns lost so many people that they had few or no voters. Yet local landowners in these rotten boroughs still sent members to Parliament. At the same time, populous new industrial cities had no seats in Parliament because they had not existed as population centers in earlier times. By 1830, Whigs and Tories were battling over a bill to reform Parliament. The Whig Party largely represented middle class and business interests. The Tory party spoke for nobles, landowners, and others whose interests and income were rooted in agriculture. Parliament finally passed the Great Reform Act in 1832. It redistributed seats in the House of Commons, giving representation to large towns and cities and eliminating rotten boroughs. It also enlarged the electorate, the body of people allowed to vote, by granting suffrage to more men. The act did, however, keep a property requirement for voting. The Reform Act of 1832 did not bring full democracy, but it did give a greater political voice to middle-class men. Landowning nobles, however, remained a powerful force in the government and in the economy. In the 1830s, protesters known as Chartists drew up the People's Charter. This petition demanded universal male suffrage, annual parliamentary elections, and salaries for members of Parliament. Another key demand was for a secret ballot, which would allow people to cast their votes without announcing them publicly. Twice the Chartists presented petitions with over 1 million signatures to Parliament. Both petitions were ignored. In 1848, as revolutions swept through Europe, the Chartists prepared a third petition and organized a march on Parliament. Fearing violence, the government moved to suppress the march. Soon after, the unsuccessful Chartist movement declined. In time, however, Parliament would pass most of the major reforms proposed by the Chartists. From 1837 to 1901, the great symbol in British life was Queen Victoria. Her reign was the longest in British history. Although she exercised little real political power, she set the tone for what is now called the Victorian Age. As Queen, Victoria came to embody the values of her age. These Victorian ideals included duty, thrift, honesty, hard work, and above all, respectability. Under Victoria, the British middle class and growing numbers of the working class felt great confidence in the future. That confidence grew as Britain expanded its already huge empire. During her reign, Victoria witnessed growing agitation for social reform. As the Victorian era went on, reformers continued the push toward greater social and economic justice. In the 1860s, a new era dawned in British politics. The old political parties regrouped under new leadership. Benjamin Disraeli forged the Tories into the modern Conservative Party. The Whigs, led by William Gladstone, evolved into the Liberal Party. Between 1868 and 1880, Gladstone and Disraeli alternated as prime ministers. Disraeli and the Conservative Party pushed through the Reform Bill of 1867. By giving the vote to many working-class men, the new law almost doubled the size of the electorate. In the 1880s, it was the turn of Gladstone and the Liberal Party to extend suffrage. Their reforms gave the vote to farm workers and most other men. By century's end, almost universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, and other Chartist ambitions had been achieved. Britain had transformed itself from a constitutional monarchy to a parliamentary democracy, a form of government in which the executive leaders, usually a prime minister and cabinet, are chosen by and responsible to the legislature and are also members of it. In the early 1900s, many bills passed by the House of Commons met defeat in the House of Lords. In 1911, a Liberal government passed measures to restrict the power of the Lords, including their power to veto tax bills. The Lords resisted. Finally, the government threatened to create enough new Lords to approve the law, and the Lords backed down. People hailed the change as a victory for democracy. In time, the House of Lords would become a largely ceremonial body with little power. The elected House of Commons would reign supreme. In the early 1800s, Britain, like other European nations, taxed foreign imports in order to protect local economies. But supporters of free trade, or trade between countries without quotas, tariffs, or other restrictions, demanded an end to such protective tariffs. They agreed that a policy of laissez-faire would increase prosperity for all. If taxes were abolished, merchants everywhere would have larger markets in which to sell their goods, and consumers would benefit from open competition. Some British tariffs were repealed in the 1820s. However, fierce debate erupted over the Corn Laws, which imposed high tariffs on imported grain. Farmers and wealthy landowners supported the Corn Laws because they kept the price of British grain high. Free traders, however, wanted Parliament to repeal the Corn Laws. They argued that repeal of these laws would lower the price of grain, make bread cheaper for workers, and open up trade in general. Parliament finally repealed the Corn Laws in 1846. However, in the late 1800s, economic hard times led Britain and other European countries to impose protective tariffs on many goods again. During the 1700s, British ships were carrying more Africans to the Americas than any other European country. Under pressure from middle-class reformers in Britain, France, and the United States, the abolition movement slowly took off. In 1807, Britain became the first European power to abolish the slave trade. Finally, in 1833, Parliament passed a law banning slavery in all British colonies. Other reforms were aimed at the criminal justice system. In the early 1800s, more than 200 crimes were punishable by death. Such capital offenses included not only murder, but also shoplifting, sheep stealing, and impersonating an army veteran. In practice, some juries refused to convict criminals because the punishments were so harsh. Executions were public occasions, and the hanging of a well-known murderer might attract thousands of curious spectators. Reformers began to reduce the number of capital offenses. By 1850, the death penalty was reserved for murder, piracy, treason, and arson. Many petty criminals were instead transported to penal colonies, or settlements for convicts. In 1868, Parliament ended public hangings. Additional reforms improved prison conditions and outlawed imprisonment due to debt. Parliament passed laws to regulate conditions in factories and mines. In 1842, for example, mine owners were forbidden to employ women or children under age 10. An 1847 law limited women and children to a 10-hour day. Later in the 1800s, the government regulated many safety conditions in factories and mines, and sent inspectors to see that the laws were enforced. Other laws set minimum wages and maximum hours of work. Early in the Industrial Revolution, labor unions were outlawed. Under pressure, government and business leaders slowly accepted worker organizations. Trade unions were made legal in 1825, but it remained illegal to go on strike until later in the century. Despite restrictions, unions spread, and gradually they won additional rights. Between 1890 and 1914, union membership soared. Besides winning higher wages and shorter hours for workers, unions pressed for other laws to improve the lives of the working class. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, both political parties enacted social reforms to benefit the working class. Disraeli sponsored laws to improve public health and housing for workers in cities. Under Gladstone, an Education Act called for free elementary education for all children. Gladstone also pushed to open up government jobs based on merit rather than on birth or wealth. Another force for reform was the Fabian Society, a socialist organization founded in 1883. The Fabians promoted gradual change through legal means rather than by violence. Though small in number, the Fabians had a strong influence on British politics. In 1900, socialists and union members backed the formation of a new political party, which became the Labour Party. The Labour Party would quickly grow in power and membership until, by the 1920s, it surpassed the Liberal Party and became one of Britain's two major parties. In the early 1900s, Britain began to pass social welfare laws to protect the well-being of the poor and disadvantaged. These laws protected workers with accident, health, and unemployment insurance as well as old age pensions. The middle class hailed reforms as proof that democracy was working. By the early 1900s, Emmeline Pankhurst, a leading suffragist, had become convinced that only aggressive tactics would bring victory. Pankhurst and other radical suffragists interrupted speakers in Parliament until they were carried away. They collected petitions and organized huge public demonstrations. When mass meetings and other peaceful efforts brought no results, some women turned to more drastic, violent protests. They smashed windows or even burned buildings. Pankhurst justified such tactics as necessary to achieve victory. Some also went on hunger strikes, risking their lives to achieve their goals. It wasn't until 1918 that Parliament finally granted suffrage to women over age 30. Younger women did not win the right to vote for another decade. Throughout the 1800s, Britain faced the ever-present Irish question. The English had begun conquering Ireland in the 1100s. In the 1600s, English and Scottish settlers colonized Ireland, taking possession of much of the best farmland. The Irish never accepted English rule. They bitterly resented settlers, especially absentee landlords who owned large estates but did not live on them. Many Irish peasants lived in desperate poverty while paying high rents to landlords living in England. In addition, the Irish, most of whom were Catholic, had to pay to support the Church of England. Under these conditions, resistance and rebellion were common. Irish nationalists campaigned for freedom and justice in the 1800s. Nationalist leader Daniel O'Connell, nicknamed the Liberator, organized an Irish Catholic League and held mass meetings to demand repeal of unfair laws. Under pressure from O'Connell and other Irish nationalists, Britain slowly moved to improve conditions in Ireland. In 1829, Parliament passed the Catholic Emancipation Act, which allowed Irish Catholics to vote and hold political office. Yet many injustices remained. Absentee landlords could evict tenants almost at will. Other British laws forbade the teaching and speaking of the Irish language. In the 1850s, some Irish militants organized the Fenian Brotherhood. Its goal was to liberate Ireland from British rule by force. In the 1870s, moderate Irish nationalists found a leader in Charles Stewart Parnell. He rallied Irish members of Parliament to press for home rule or local self-government. The Irish question disrupted English politics. At times, political parties were so deeply split over the Irish question that they could not take care of other business. As Prime Minister, Gladstone pushed for reforms in Ireland. He ended the use of Irish money to support the church and tried to ease the hardships of Irish tenant farmers. New laws prevented landlords from charging unfair rents and protected the rights of tenants to the land they worked. Finally, in 1914, Parliament passed a Home Rule Bill, but it delayed putting the new law into effect when World War I broke out that year. The southern counties of Ireland finally became independent in 1921.
France under Napoleon III. Starting after the Revolution of 1848, Napoleon III rose to power and set up the Second Empire. People saw him as a great leader who would be able to change the ways of society and fix major problems. His promises to end poverty gave the lower class hope. His name seemed to draw people because of the reminder of the days when France was greater than all of Europe. Napoleon III, however, would not be able to live up to his famous uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. Limits on liberty. The Second Empire looked a lot like a constitutional monarchy. Napoleon III ruled like a dictator. He had the power to appoint the cabinet, the upper house legislature, and many officials. Debate was limited and newspapers were heavily censored. In the 1860s, Napoleon began to pull back some and gave more power to the legislature. When the war with Prussia began, Napoleon III issued a new constitution that extended democratic rights. Promoting economic growth. France prospered at mid-century. Napoleon was promoting new ideas that would make his country prosper, such as railroad building, the urban renewal of Paris, and he invested more in industry. Another person that helped France prosper at this time was Ferdinand de Lesseps. He organized the building of the Suez Canal, which would link the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Foreign adventures. Napoleon was doing well with France and creating new wealth, but he did not have such an easy time with foreign affairs. When he tried to place Maximilian as the ruler of Mexico in hopes of expanding French rule, the people of Mexico resisted his rule and the U.S. did not agree with the situation. After 4 years, France withdrew and Maximilian was overthrown and killed by patriots. Challenges of the Third Republic. When Napoleon was captured, the Republicans in Paris put an end to the Second Empire. At first, they set up a temporary government, or provisional. This provisional would eventually become the Third Republic. The Paris Commune. In 1871, when an uprising broke out in Paris, the rebels created what was known as the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune's goal was to save the Republic from royalists. The rebels were called communards, and they ranged from workers and socialists to bourgeois republicans. Their reason for the uprising was because they rejected the harsh peace that the National Assembly had signed with Germany. When the National Assembly ordered the Paris Commune to disband, the communards refused. After the refusal, the National Assembly sent troops to retake Paris. This civil war went on for weeks, and as the government forces moved forward, rebels set fire to government buildings and killed some of their hostages. The government forces killed about 20,000 communards, and that was the end of the Paris Commune. The suppression of the Paris Commune deepened social divisions in France. Government structure. The Third Republic remained in power for 70 years. Their system had a two-house legislature, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Together, these two houses selected a president of the Republic. The position, though, had little power and was mainly used for show. Most power was given to the premier. Unlike Britain, which had a two-party system, France had a wide range of parties that reflected the wide range of splits in the country. In order to win a vote, politicians had to form coalitions, or alliances with other parties. Even though coalition governments are popular throughout Europe, they are usually very unstable. In the first 10 years of the Republic, 50 coalitions formed and fell through. Political scandals. In the late 1800s, political scandals shook public trust in the government. Bollinger was accused of plotting to overthrow the government after rallying royalists and ultranationalists who wanted revenge on Germany. Another time, the nephew of the president was caught selling nominations for France's highest award. Anti-Semitism and the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus, a high-ranking military officer, was accused of being a German spy. At his trial, however, neither he nor his lawyer was allowed to see the evidence against him. Military elites detested Dreyfus for being in such a high position and being Jewish. Even though he claimed innocence, he was convicted and condemned to life in prison. In 1896, when new evidence arose and pointed to another officer, the military still did not grant Dreyfus a new trial. Deep divisions. The Dreyfus Affair further deepened the divisions in French politics. Each party had their own beliefs, whether they were fighting for justice and equality, or if they were fighting for the side of the anti-Semitics. Émile Zola joined the battle when he wrote an article in which he charged the government with suppressing the truth. As a result of the article, Zola was convicted of libel, or the knowing publication of false information. Eventually, the side fighting for equality made progress, and the evidence against Dreyfus was shown to be forged. A French court cleared Dreyfus of all charges and restored all his honors. Calls for a Jewish state. The Dreyfus case reflected the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. Anti-Semitics were often members of the lower middle class who felt insecure about their economic position. They adopted an aggressive intolerance for outsiders and a violent hatred towards Jews. When Theodor Herzl saw the way the Jewish people were being treated, he called for Jews to form their own separate state. In this state, they would have rights that were denied to them in other European countries. Herzl helped launch modern Zionism, a movement that was dedicated to rebuilding a Jewish state in Palestine. Reforms in France. France achieved many new reforms in the early 1900s. They passed laws that regulated work hours and improved conditions in the workplace. They also set up a system of free public elementary schools as a campaign to reduce the power of the Catholic Church. Separating the church and state. France wanted to repress the involvement of the church in state affairs. Republicans saw the church as a conservative force that opposed progressive policies. To repress the church, the government closed church schools, along with many monasteries and convents. In 1905, France passed a law that separated the church from the state and also stopped paying the salaries of the clergy. Catholics, Jews, and Protestants were free to worship however they pleased, but would not have any special treatment from the government. Women's rights. Under the Napoleonic Code, women had few rights. By the 1890s, a growing women's rights movement sought legal reforms. One right that was gained was that married women had the right to their own earnings. In 1909, Jeanne Elizabeth Schmal found the French Union for Women's Suffrage. This group favored legal protest. Liberal men, however, were reluctant to grant women suffrage because they feared the women would vote for church and conservative causes. Therefore, women did not win the vote until after World War II. Looking ahead. In 1914, France was the largest democratic country in Europe. There was a constitution that protected basic rights, and their economy was usually prosperous. It had expanded its overseas empire so that it was only second to Britain. Territorial expansion. The United States has always followed a policy of expansionism. When the United States first came to be, it stretched from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. When Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, it doubled the size of the United States. This was known as the Louisiana Purchase. In 1846, we added Florida, Oregon, and the Republic of Texas to the United States. The Mexican War from 1846 to 1848 added California and the rest of the Southwest. Americans claimed that the United States was so great that it should spread across the whole continent from sea to sea. Some even wanted to absorb Canada and Mexico into the United States. The idea of the country spreading across the whole continent was known as the Manifest Dynasty. The closest we came was the purchase of Alaska from Russia and the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. Expanding democracy. In the 1800s, the United States had the most liberal suffrage in the world. Only land-owning white men could vote. By the 1830s, most white men had the right to vote. Democracy was far from complete. The two movements that highlighted the limits of American democracy were the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. Calls for abolition. In the early 1800s, Americans began to call for the complete end to slavery. In the 1850s, the battle over slavery began to intensify. Each new state entered the Union, and pro- and anti-slavery forces met in violent confrontations to decide whether or not slavery would be legal in the new state. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, convinced many Northerners that slavery was a great social evil. Women's rights movement. Women worked hard in the anti-slavery movement. It became apparent to women, though, that there were also many laws restricting their lives. When Lucretta Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, they were forbidden to speak because they were women. This was just the start of it all. After this, women began to protest the laws and customs that limited their lives. The women's rights movement stood by the saying, "All men and women are created equal." and set its goal for equality in the workplace and in education. Some women also began to demand votes. The Civil War and its aftermath. Economics and the slavery issue drove the North and South apart. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, that was the breaking point. Since Lincoln opposed the extension of slavery into new territories, Southerners feared that he would abolish slavery altogether. To them, that was the government infringing upon their states' rights. North versus the South. After Lincoln's election, the Southern states seceded or withdrew from the Union. They then formed the Confederate States of America. This action sparked the Civil War, which would last from 1861 to 1865. Since the South had fewer resources, fewer people, and less industry than the North, it didn't have much of a chance at winning. The Confederacy finally surrendered in 1865. The struggle would cost more than 600,000 lives and would be the largest casualties of war in the history of American wars. Challenges of the African Americans. During the war, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It set all enslaved African Americans in the South free. Then, 3 new amendments were added to the Constitution to ban slavery throughout the entire country. It also allowed for African American men to have the right to vote. In the South, however, there were still many problems. State laws in the South imposed segregation in hospitals, schools, and other public areas. There were also laws to restrict the eligibility of voting for African American men. Economic growth and social reform. After the Civil War, the United States would lead the world in industrial and agricultural production. Growing networks of communication devices, along with transportation and improving political stability, helped this along. Business and labor. By 1900, giant monopolies controlled whole industries. Andrew Carnegie built the nation's largest steel company, and John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company dominated the petroleum industry. However, in factories, wages were low and there were poor working conditions. American workers organized labor unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, in order to defend their interests. Unions sought better hours and cleaner working conditions. Populists and progressives. Farmers also organized themselves to defend their interests. In the 1890s, they joined city workers to support the new Populist Party. The Populist Party never became a major party, but their ideas for reform, such as 8-hour workdays, would eventually become law. Reformers, also known as progressives, also pressed for change. They wanted to ban child labor, limit working hours, limit monopolies, and give voters more power. Another goal was voting rights for women. American suffragists finally won the vote when the 19th Amendment went into effect.